You should just walk home instead of taking the car. There's only space for one with all the luggage.
With a smirk on his face, my husband, Robert, said something outrageous. Joining in, my son, James, who was with him, deepened his grin and threw more heartless words my way.
Yeah, that's a great idea. It's about 5 hours from here to home. It'll be a good chance to get some exercise.
That day, I had returned after finishing some work tasks with James. Robert had come to pick us up, but both he and James were wearing oddly smug smiles. I was wondering what was going on when they told me to walk home. So that's what James was grinning about on the plane. He was planning this all along. I let out a deep breath, utterly unimpressed. Then, looking between the two of them, I spoke firmly. I'm heading out on an overseas assignment, so you two can go home without me. Oh, but I've already sold the house, so there's no place for you to return to.
What?
What do you mean, sold the house?
The smiles quickly vanished from their flustered faces. In contrast, I allowed a small smirk to lift the corners of my lips. As I explained the truth, I watched the color drain from their faces. My name is Michelle, and I'm a 47-year-old office worker. Everyone has one or two bitter memories, I suppose. I have such memories, and when I think about them, it still pains me. The memory was that my marriage had broken up in the past. Even though it's been about 20 years, the wound is still deep, and I can recall it vividly. Back then, I was in a relationship with my boyfriend Nick, with marriage in mind. We had been together since our college days and could talk about anything. He was both a lover and a best friend. After a few years of dating, we started living together, and marriage was finally on the horizon. Preparing for that inevitable day, I occasionally bought bridal magazines and started reading them. What kind of home could we build if we got married? I hope it would be a home full of laughter and smiles. That's what I was thinking at the time, and I shared those thoughts with Nick. He smiled warmly and said he felt the same way.
If it's you and me, Michelle, we'll be fine. We can get through anything.
That's what he said, but one day, we decided to get tested for fertility issues before getting married. We wanted our children for a long time. The results showed that the problem was on my side. After learning this, his love for me visibly began to fade. Whenever I tried to talk to him, his responses were cold and distant. The way he looked at me changed. His gaze became emotionless and cold, so unlike before. He stopped talking about marriage altogether. In fact, we barely had any normal conversations.
I'm sorry. I want to break up.
And so, he finally told me he wanted to end things. Since that day, I've resigned myself to the idea that marriage just isn't for me. I don't need romance anymore. My job is like my partner now. After that, I threw myself into my work. But one day, my uncle, Steve, suggested I go on a blind date. Since my parents had passed away, Steve had become like a father to me. He also worked at the same company, holding the position of branch manager in another state, so I was indebted to him professionally as well.
I'm worried about you, Michelle.
He said, and since I couldn't refuse someone who had done so much for me, I agreed to go on the blind date. The meeting place was a famous French restaurant that had been featured in a gourmet magazine. It was a place known for its beautiful views of the city at night, so the restaurant was filled with couples. There was even a man who seemed so nervous that it was clear he was about to propose. He kept checking the inside of his jackets repeatedly. He was probably hiding an engagement ring. but I couldn't let myself get distracted, so I shook my head slightly and focused on my date. His name was Robert, and he was 5 years older than me. Because of this, he seemed quite mature. His manner of speaking was calm and composed, and while I didn't feel any romantic attraction yet, I found him very likable as a person. Despite the slight age gap, we were almost the same generation. We found many common interests during our conversation, and it flowed smoothly. We even discovered that, although we worked in different departments, we were both employed by the same company. It was a little surprise set up by Steve. I was surprised. I never expected we'd work at the same company.
Yeah, with so many employees, it's not unusual to never cross paths if we're in different departments.
In a calm, almost indifferent tone, he mentioned that he had lost his previous wife and was raising a high school-aged son on his own.
I've been thinking that my son needs a mother figure, so I started considering remarriage. That's why I decided to try this blind date.
Robert continued to speak in his calm, steady voice. And sitting next to him was his son, James. When I looked at them side by side, I noticed how much they resembled each other. It seemed like James was going through a growth spurt, as they were almost the same height. I wonder if their voices and way of speaking are similar too. With that thought in mind, I waited for James to speak, but he just stared at the edge of the table, saying nothing. Even when Robert tried to start a conversation, James would just look down. Maybe he was shy around new people. Did Robert bring him to this blind date to see if I would be a suitable mother? I wonder if we'll be able to get along someday. With a mix of hope and a bit of anxiety, our blind date came to an end. A few days later, we met again. This time, we decided to have dinner at a restaurant with a more relaxed atmosphere. But once again, James didn't say a word. However, there was one small difference this time. He started looking up and making eye contact with me. After that, we went out for meals a few more times, took a couple of trips together, and gradually, my relationship with Robert deepened. Eventually, we got married. After the wedding, Robert, James, and I began living together in the house I inherited from my late parents.
Wow, what a magnificent house.
When we moved in, Robert seemed unusually delighted, walking around the house with a big smile. He inspected every room, the living room, kitchen, bathroom, and even the laundry room. It didn't seem like he was just trying to familiarize himself with the place. He was observing everything closely. I found it odd and tilted my head in confusion. "Did you see something unusual?" I asked casually.
No, I just wanted to take a good look around.
Robert laughed and said that, then started unpacking, so I didn't push the matter any further. As our married life began, my lifestyle gradually changed. Wanting to balance both work and home, I decided to switch to telecommuting. This naturally meant I spent more time at home. However, James didn't seem to like having me around. His once shy demeanor from the blind date turned into something much harsher. He started giving me hostile looks, openly making hissing sounds, and whenever he spoke, it was often filled with insults. This was probably the real James, who had initially been putting on a facade to test the waters.
Seriously, just looking at your face pisses me off. I can't believe Dad remarried someone like you.
Whenever I tried to say something to reprimand him for those kinds of words, James would smirk and respond like this.
What? Don't act like you're my mom. You really piss me off. Maybe I should tell Dad you're verbally abusing me and tried to hit me.
Arguing with him drained my energy, so I began pretending not to hear him whenever his verbal attacks started. Even as he grew older, James's attitude never changed. He continued to treat me with contempt. Yet, it seemed he only reserved this behavior for me because his friends seemed to think he was a good guy. There were times when he brought his friends over to the house, and during those visits, he would flash a charming smile and introduce me to them.
This is my mom. She's working from home now.
Nice to meet you. It was the first time he called me mom, and I was so shocked that I almost let out a surprised yelp. However, James shot me an intimidating look, as if warning me not to say anything unnecessary. So, I forced a smile and managed to greet them.
James is such a great guy.
On the way home, when his friend said that to me, I couldn't help but widen my eyes in surprise. A great guy? The same person who deliberately hisses at me, ignores me, and hurls insults. At school, he must be playing the role of the kind, top student his friends see him as. Maybe he's taking out the stress of maintaining that image on me. I started to feel like I was no longer seen as a person, but merely as a tool for him to relieve his stress. I just smiled and brushed it off, seeing his friend off. But the incident left a strong impression on me. I'm sure that even after he enters the workforce, he'll continue to hide his cruel side and present himself as a capable, friendly person to those around him. I retreated to my home office and let out a deep sigh.
Why is the old lady here? You're ruining the atmosphere.
Whenever I spent time in the living room or other common areas, James would target me, hurling insults, so the only places I could relax in the house were my room, the bathroom, or the shower. Time passed, and eventually, James became an adult and entered the workforce. James joined the same company where Robert and I worked. However, he worked at a different location, where Steve was the branch manager. Because of this, Steve would occasionally bring up James during our phone calls. According to him, James was working hard and was well respected by his senior colleagues. Of course. I sighed. It seemed like James was very good at maintaining his outward appearance. In a way, you could say he was skilled at navigating social situations, but the way he took out his stress on others was absolutely wrong. After James started working, his verbal abuse towards me worsened, likely due to the increased stress. He even stopped calling me old lady and started referring to me as old hag at some point.
I don't want to eat food made by an old hag. I'm already exhausted from my job, and eating this stuff just makes it worse.
James would casually throw out such remarks, and on particularly bad days, he'd even go so far as to dump his food in the trash right in front of me. I thought I'd reached my limit and tried talking to Robert about it, but it was pointless. Although Robert had been kind at the beginning of our marriage, as time went on, he started to neglect me. When I mentioned James's verbal abuse, Robert would just snort dismissively, barely acknowledging what I said. I need you to say something to him too. If this keeps up, my stress is only going to get worse. Even though I was speaking seriously, Robert just smirked, which made me raise my voice in frustration. But still, he wouldn't listen. He seemed like a completely different person from the man I had met during our blind date. Why did I ever think he was a gentle person back then? There isn't a single person in this house who's on my side. Thinking this, I felt a heavy weight settle in my chest, and a sense of despair darkened my view. Just as the situation continued, James announced that he was getting married. A few years had passed since he started working, and his income had stabilized. When I heard the news, it felt like a ray of light had finally broken through. Surely, I thought, James wouldn't behave so cruelly towards me in front of his wife. Also, up until now, I had been the only woman in the house, so there were many things Robert and James couldn't understand. I thought that with another woman around, we might be able to relate to each other and have more in common. I first met James's fiancée, Grace, during their marriage meeting. She was 3 years younger than James.
Nice to meet you. I'm Grace.
Her voice was clear and strong, and my first impression of her was that she was a cheerful person. I had a vague feeling that she might become the bright, sunny presence this household needed. However, that hope was quickly dashed. After they got married, the four of us started living together, but my suffering only deepened.
Old lady, this spot is dirty, you know? If you're supposed to be a housewife, shouldn't you at least clean properly?
Grace would point to a corner of the room, smirking as she spoke, clearly pleased with herself. Just like Robert and James, Grace began to treat me with condescension. It wasn't that she changed because of their influence. She likely had this side of her all along and just hid it during our first meeting. However, it seemed she did pick up on how James addressed me. At first, she called me Michelle, but before I knew it, she had started calling me old lady. It seems true that birds of a feather flock together. It's true that like attracts like. As I watched the identical smiles on James and Grace's faces, I sighed. Her criticisms weren't limited to just the cleaning. If dinner was delayed because I was busy with work, she would blame me for not preparing it faster. When the clothes she wanted to wear hadn't been washed, she would hysterically demand why I hadn't done the laundry. Grace didn't work. Despite being a stay-at-home wife, she didn't do any housework at all. I'm busy with work too, so sometimes I can't get to the chores right away. Could you maybe help out when that happens, Grace? I've asked her this more than once or twice. I tried to speak as politely as possible, not wanting to provoke her, but the moment she heard it, her face twisted with anger, and she snapped.
What? Why should I have to do that? I'm busy too. Do you think I just sit around all day?
But isn't that exactly what you do? Grace's lifestyle was a mess. She stayed up late and wouldn't wake up until well past noon. Even when she did come into the living room in her loungewear, she'd either lounge on the sofa playing with her phone or read the comics James had collected. She didn't care at all if I was doing chores during my lunch break. After eating the meals I prepared, she would just leave the dishes in the sink without even pretending to wash them. Or she would dress up and go out. She often went out not just nearby, but to places farther away, sometimes not returning until late at night or even the next morning. Hey, James, could you ask Grace to help out with the housework? It doesn't seem to make a difference when I ask her. Terrified that I might get yelled at again, I asked James in a trembling voice, but he only looked at me with an icy, cold stare. Robert, who was nearby and overheard, reacted in the same way.
What's the big deal? You don't seem to be struggling right now.
Whether he knew or didn't know that I was rushing to do the laundry, cleaning, and cooking after work, James casually dismissed me with those words. By not struggling, he seemed to mean that there weren't piles of laundry or dishes, and the house wasn't cluttered with things left unorganized. I was speechless after all. I had come to him because I was struggling. To make matters worse, Robert then chimed in, adding insult to injury.
You're home every day, so it's fine, isn't it? Grace is fine. She's young and cute, so she doesn't need to worry about doing chores. She should enjoy her freedom while she can.
I couldn't believe he was defending her like that, and I furrowed my brow in disbelief. In the end, this issue was brushed aside, and my concerns were never addressed. But my frustration wasn't just about Grace not helping with housework. It was also about how close Robert seemed to be to her. No, if anything, it seemed like he was the one getting overly close to her. Just like when I brought up the topic of housework, he would take every chance to call Grace cute. And on top of that, he would say it directly to her.
Wow, Grace, you're really cute. I wish Michelle would take a lesson from you. Oh, but I guess it's too late for her. She's already an old lady, so it doesn't matter if she tries anymore.
It had become a routine for him to praise Grace while insulting me. Grace, for her part, didn't seem to mind at all and would smile as she wrapped herself around his arm. Why did I have to be subjected to this? It felt like a kind of torture. Fed up, I started retreating to the kitchen or my room whenever Robert would start talking about Grace, just to avoid seeing the two of them together. Why am I even putting up with this? The thought suddenly crossed my mind. This was the house I inherited from my parents. Simply put, this house should be mine, but it was Robert and the other two who were taking control. Even though I was already enduring days that felt like they were draining my spirit, something happened that completely sapped what little energy I had left. One night, I woke up and headed to the bathroom. It was around 1 a.m., and usually the whole house would be dark at that hour, but I noticed the living room light was on. I could hear hushed voices, as if someone was having a quiet conversation. I stopped in my tracks and strained to listen in. It was Robert, James, and Grace, all still awake. It sounded like they were having a late-night drink together, their voices slurred as if they were tipsy.
She's really useless, isn't she? A total failure as a woman.
Even though they didn't mention my name, I knew they were talking about me. I held my breath without realizing it, listening intently to their conversation.
Didn't you say you never wanted to marry that old hag in the first place?
Exactly. I only agreed to the marriage for the sake of my career. I never liked her at all. She was so easy to manipulate. It was almost laughable.
Following Robert's words, James and Grace burst out laughing, clearly finding it all very amusing. The fact that they were all mocking me together made me reach the end of my patience. I could almost hear something snapping inside me, a breaking point. It was the sound of my tolerance finally shattering. Staring into the void, I clenched my fist tightly and resolved to get a divorce and exact my revenge. Just a few days later, James and I had to go to the main office for work, so we packed our bags and flew there together. Even on the way back, we were side by side, but there was no conversation between us. James typically only talks to me at home or when no one else is around. I didn't say anything either. Maybe he found it odd because I could feel his glances from the seat next to me, but I pretended not to notice. However, as the plane got closer to the airport, I began to feel uneasy. For some reason, James had a smile on his face. It wasn't the kind of genuine smile that naturally appears when something good happens. It felt almost sinister. A bad feeling crept over me, sending chills down my arms. I prayed that we would get home safely without anything happening, but that hope was in vain.
Hey, over here. Good job today.
When we arrived at the airport, Robert was there to pick us up, but he only had eyes for James. It was as if I had suddenly become invisible. He didn't even glance in my direction. He started talking to James about work, completely ignoring me as I stood there holding my bags, feeling utterly drained. I'm exhausted from this long trip too. Just as I was about to sigh, Robert finally turned to me. Then he said something absolutely outrageous.
You know what? You should just walk home instead of taking the car. There's only space for one with all the luggage.
James jumped in, grinning as he cruelly added his own heartless words.
Yeah, that's a great idea. It takes about 5 hours. It'll be a good chance to get some exercise.
So that's what James was grinning about on the plane. He was planning this all along. I let out a deep breath, utterly unimpressed. Then, looking between the two of them, I spoke firmly. I'm heading out on an overseas assignment, so you two can go home without me. Oh, but I've already sold the house, so there's no place for you to return to.
What?
What do you mean, sold the house?
The truth was, I had been at the main office because Steve had already given me orders for an overseas transfer. I was heading straight to the overseas branch after this. While they stood there in shock, I handed them the final blow. It was a divorce. Here you go. We're getting a divorce, so just sign and file this, okay? I casually pulled out a divorce form from my bag, already filled out on my end. When I firmly handed it to Robert, he took it weakly, clearly shaken. All right then. Thanks. When I said that with a smile, Robert's expression momentarily showed surprise, but then his eyebrows shot up as anger spread across his face.
I'll divorce you. Staying with someone like you was boring anyway. You'll never find happiness as a woman.
His words were meant to hurt, but they didn't affect me at all. I knew it was nothing more than sour grapes.
That's right. We can easily buy a new house, so it's not a problem at all.
James joined in, trying to sound tough. I turned my back on them and smirked to myself. A month later, while I was at work, my phone rang. It was a call from Grace. She had gone out of her way to make an international call. Hello. My voice, now free from that house, was noticeably brighter than it had been before. In contrast to my tone, Grace's voice on the other end of the line was dark and somber.
This isn't the time to be talking so cheerfully. We're in a terrible situation here, and it's all your fault, old lady.
Apparently, after I left, Robert and James found themselves in a difficult situation. As they had proudly claimed, James and Robert rushed to rent an apartment together. It was a relatively new building, with a clean exterior and interior, but it quickly became a mess. Grace, who couldn't manage the housework, let the place fall into disarray. Dirty dishes piled up in the sink because she never washed them. Since she couldn't keep up with the laundry, they sometimes wore the same clothes for several days in a row. Used towels and undergarments began to reek, and the floor was littered with garbage bags that they forgot to take out on trash day.
Why don't you clean up while we're at work? Aren't you supposed to be a housewife?
Shut up. You could help out a little too, you know?
The insults that used to be directed at me were now scattered among the three of them, and they began to turn on each other. They even started arguing late at night, leading to constant complaints from their neighbors.
I'm not working, so I have to rely on those two for money. That's why I can't get a divorce. Please, Michelle, come back and help me.
It had been a long time since I'd heard her call me that, but since I was now divorced from Robert, I was no longer her mother-in-law. I had no ties to any of them anymore. I had no obligation to help her. Even after hearing about their current situation, I felt no sympathy. I'm not coming back to you. Sorry, but the situation you're in now is entirely your own doing.
No, it can't be.
Even without seeing her, I could tell her shoulders had slumped in defeat. But I didn't care and decided to mention that I had sent James evidence of her affairs with Robert and other men.
What? How could you do that?
Ignoring her panicked outburst, I hung up the phone. A year later, I returned to the US after finishing my assignment abroad. Steve, who had come to pick me up at the airport, raised a hand in greeting, looking pleased to see me. Then, he told me what had happened to Robert and the others. The atmosphere in the household had become completely tense, and Robert and James, who had once gotten along reasonably well, had grown to despise each other. The two of them started accumulating stress over the smallest things. Eventually, that stress exploded, leading to a massive fight that ended with them severing ties completely.
Those two, right?
Yeah, ever since they divorced Michelle, they've been fighting every day.
Their domestic troubles had become gossip within the company, and the two of them became the subjects of curious stares from everyone around them. Unable to bear it, they both quit their jobs almost simultaneously. With their income cut off, they were forced into a difficult life. As for Grace, after being discovered having an affair with a married man, she was sued by his wife for damages and ended up buried in debt. But none of that had anything to do with me anymore. Having been recognized for my abilities at the overseas branch, I threw myself into my work and enjoyed my single life to the fullest.